And next, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. Chairman, first and foremost, we would like to wish you and the members of the Bureau successful and fruitful work during the 74th session of the General Assembly. We would like to express our gratitude to the Secretary General for drafting the recent report on progress in implementing the Declaration on Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism. This document contains the most up-to-date information on efforts of states to implement their international legal counterterrorism obligations. Reports on work in that area year by year are presented annually by our country as well as by others. Sir, the current situation in the area of counter-terrorism security can be characterized first and foremost by an expansion of the influence of large-scale terrorist formations during armed conflicts and the formation of new launch pads for terrorist acts in once calm regions. After the military defeat in Syria and Iraq, the leadership of ISIS channeled key resources into regrouping, into bolstering its ideological basis, and into finding human resources to developed sleeper cell networks throughout the entire world. ISIS fighters are trying to strengthen their positions in Afghanistan, to establish good branches in South Asia, and to expand their presence in the Asia-Pacific region, and develop cooperation with different terrorist groups in North and West Africa, and also expand their undermining activities in European countries. Given the pseudo-caliphate Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda is also trying to re-establish its position and attract new recruits. In these circumstances, the pertinence of the Russian initiative to form a unified counter-terrorism front under the auspices of the UN on the basis of the principle in its charter is extremely important. We are in favor of good faith counter-terrorism cooperation, refusing double standards and refusing hidden agendas. We're against the use of terrorist group to achieve political or geopolitical purposes. It is not acceptable to violate international law or to have military acts of aggression against sovereign states or to interfere in their domestic affairs. This includes using the excuse of terrorism or using the excuse of preventing extremism phenomena. So we would like to share with you some considerations on current counterterrorism matters that are the remit of the Sixth Committee. Currently, the international community is grappling with the problem of the repatriation, the prosecution, the rehabilitation and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters, FTFs, and members of their families. We are convinced that terrorists should be tried in national courts, focusing on the principle of punishment being there once and for all, and punishment needs to be commensurate with the crime committed. The international cooperation here needs to ensure the unswerving respect for the relevant provisions of the Universal Counterterrorism Convention, including the principle to extradite or to prosecute. Russia consistently is in favor of transferring FTFs detained in Syria to the legitimate authorities of the country. Attempts to confer upon different groups the right to have detention areas for fighters and, furthermore, to decide on their fate is unlawful. At the same time, we caution our partners from the temptation to place all responsibility for work on these people, on those states that are in armed conflicts, or we caution against completely washing their hands of this issue. The family members of the FTFs that are unlawfully in Syria and Iraq and who are not suspected of being involved in terrorist activities must extremely quickly be repatriated to the country of their citizenship. It is crucially important to harness as broadly as possible international treaties in order to promote mutual legal assistance regarding terrorists. We draw attention to the fact that during the most recent GCTS review, the UNGA urged all states to cooperate on the principle of mutuality in the absence of such treaties. In this regard, we would also like to remind you of our proposal to improve existing extradition mechanisms. In the context of the issue of FTFs, we basically are in favour of drafting additional means of exchanging information on the movements of fighters. Mr. Chairman, we are convinced that attention should also be paid to the crucially important issue of developing collective measures to eradicate different forms of fueling terrorism, for example, people, material, finances, and of course, weapons. Over recent years, the Security Council has made significant progress in developing new requirements for states inter alia to prevent weapons from getting into the hands of terrorists. In this regard, we note the particular importance of resolutions 2370, 2462, and 2482. Nonetheless, terrorist groups in the Middle East, even today, continue to get military-grade equipment from external sponsors, and they don't mind if they carry out terrible acts with this. Once again, we'd like to caution all states to not to transfer to radical elements non-lethal assistance that often is provided to conflict areas with the excuse of assisting the moderate opposition. We also need to point out that one of the most worrisome trends of late is the use of unmanned aerial vehicles by terrorist groups. Fighters have been able to refit civilian UAVs and made them into military-grade ones. They've been exchanging ways to do this on the internet, and they're using breaches in control mechanisms regarding dual-use technologies. Sir, we would like also to point out the importance of collective efforts to counter ideological expansion of today's terrorism and the importance of preventing the recruitment of terrorists through the internet, the establishment of unilateral mechanisms and artificial barriers both to cooperation between states and also to public-private partnerships on combating the spread of terrorist content helps terrorists to use the online area. Combating terrorism propaganda needs to be done collectively. Of course, we mustn't forget about those who've already been lured in by the ideology of violence and terror. Law enforcement measures need to be there, but they need to be accompanied by campaigns led by well-respected experts and religious leaders. This should be carried out on the basis of 2354 and its comprehensive international framework for combating terrorism ideology. We're in favour of continuing to develop unified standards here. This will be based on existing international legal standards in the area of counterterrorism and would involve states and their relevant agencies on terrorist propaganda, including the use of the internet. We agree that when combating terrorism and different forms of extremism, there's a need to pay due attention to the respect for human rights, and consideration needs to be given to gender and youth. Particular attention should be given to this when we're talking about the return of family members of FTFs to their homeland. We should understand, however, that speculation here and shifting the focus onto subordinate issues do not help counterterrorism cooperation within the UN. We are also disappointed with the ongoing waste of resources in the specific UN structures spent on the very debatable concept of countering violent extremism. We would urge these structures to understand that CVE plays a secondary role as compared to countering terrorism, and they shouldn't rubber stamp this just to please donors. The Russian Federation is prepared to have proper dialogue and to develop unified approaches to counterterrorism. In this regard, we would propose all interested states to look at the international legal framework for this work that is in the innovative Shanghai Cooperation Agreement Convention on Countering Extremism. We would like to remind you that this instrument is one that all states can accede to. Mr. Chair, we believe that there's a need to have the appropriate work carried out by the UNOCT. And here the GA conferred upon it a whole number of tasks regarding capacity building for countries in need. It is absolutely unacceptable when UN structures use blackmail, including financial blackmail. We're convinced that the project work of the UNOCT should be carried out on the request of the states themselves with the support of the GCTS and also the relevant Security Council resolutions and the recommendations of the Security Council Counterterrorism Committee. We intend to continue to provide active support to the UNOCT, and we want to work with it. Based on the Russia's contributions, we are going to start a new program for activity for the UNOCT to counter fueling of terrorism. We are convinced that work in this and many other areas cannot have the due effect without close cooperation with regional organizations. In this regard, we welcome cooperation between the UNOCT and the CIS Anti-Terrorism Center, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Counterterrorism Structure, and also that of the CSTO. There's a need to work together to assist these efforts of our organization. And this was demonstrated during the Security Council ministerial debate that took place as part of the Russian presidency of the Security Council on the 20th of September. Sir, in order to ensure the effectiveness of counterterrorism cooperation, there's a need to develop and strengthen its treaty legal basis. There's a need not only to expand the number of participants in the Universal Conventions and their protocols, but also to improve the productivity of its implementation. An important signal here could be agreement upon a comprehensive International Terrorism Convention. Russia is still prepared to actively participate in finding compromise solution on wording that has not yet been agreed upon on the draft of this document. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.